Hey there, Urban Roots fans. This is your host, Deaqua Hussein Wetzel, and you're listening to Urban Roots, the podcast where we preserve place through story. Today's bonus episode is a special one that features Cecily King, an associate professor of professional practice in the real estate development program. She even teaches a course titled Equitable Development. And she's the founder of Kipling Development, a Detroit-based real estate development and consulting firm committed to inclusive and transformative projects that create housing equity and access in major U.S. urban centers. In this conversation with Cecily, we talk about how identity and representation shape design, finance, and the future of cities. And we dive into her practical journey from structural engineering to public sector housing leadership and real estate development. We discuss what equitable development really looks like in praxis and what it means to develop with community rather than around it. This episode is sponsored by Layla Youssef, a licensed real estate agent in New York State and Pennsylvania with Compass. As a buyer's and seller's agent that works in Manhattan, Philadelphia, and Bucks County, PA, she brings deep market knowledge and an unwavering commitment to trust, loyalty, and discretion in the built environment. A testament to her over 13 years of experience in the field, where she's closed more than $150 million in transactions. Now, before we get to the interview, I have to shout out the latest episode of Black Preservation Stories that's been sitting with me. It's titled We're Still Here Defend Glendale and Public Housing Coalition. And it's all about the community led efforts to preserve Glendale townhomes in Minneapolis, Minnesota. For decades, this post war housing site has been home to generations of Somali immigrants and Black American families. With an uphill battle for local historic designation, this place remains a powerful reminder that while it has withstood many eras of development, it endures because its community refuses to disappear. This honestly speaks to me as a first generation Somalilander, and I'm beyond moved. But don't take my word for it. Hear it for yourself in this clip.
We've been pushing for historic designation 2017, 2018. And the council member would just put us through hoops. He would say, do one survey, go back, let's have another meeting, let's do this. And everybody got tired. They're like, can we just get this done? And we realized that we were just being railroaded. These people don't really want this to happen. Other properties, it would take a year, maybe max, to get historic designation. Us, 2016, 2017, 2018, 2019, 2020, 2021, 22, 23, 24, 25. We're still waiting. We're still waiting. The exhibit that embarrassed a lot of people, okay, and showed that these homes have history. According to Minneapolis, they only have 200 sites that are historically designated. Out of those 200 sites, only 7 properties that are not white. So 7 out of 200. So imagine what they think about public housing.
Black Preservation Stories is a brand new podcast by the Black Grassroots Heritage Preservation Network, hosted and produced by Marcus Smith. You can listen at bghpn.org or wherever you get podcasts. Now, before we jump into the episode, I have one last bit of housekeeping. This Giving Tuesday, we're calling in the family. Storytellers, neighbors, listeners, and supporters to help us sustain our Black storytelling work. Through our brand new Kinfolk Give Back initiative, we invite you to show up for your community like you show up for family by supporting stories, elders, neighborhoods, and cultural memories that sustain Black life across the African diaspora. Every single gift, whether it's big or small, helps us preserve the cultural heritage of underrepresented neighborhoods, places, spaces, elevate local voices, and build more equitable futures rooted in community. We rely on your support, so please go to our show notes and learn how to be a part of our Kinfolk Give Back today. And now, my interview with Cecily King.
My name is Cecily King. I am the founder and managing principal of Kipling Development. We are an organization that focuses on housing. As an investor, as a developer, as an owner, I've been working in Detroit, Michigan for the last 10 years. But as a consultant, I work around the country, always on issues of housing affordability. And for me, affordability, I always call it lowercase a affordability. I'm not necessarily just talking about deeply affordable. I'm talking about housing that's accessibly priced and affordable to a range of people and producing a range of different types of housing to serve different types of households and families.
That's super cool. And I definitely want to get more into that. But I think I should also say that when I originally talked to you just to chit chat, you told me a little bit about your practice, but you also were telling me about the work that you do at Columbia or like why you got into teaching at Columbia. Your class is titled Equitable Development. So, as we go through this conversation, we will unpack the term equitable development. But before we get there, I'm going to go back
Mhm.
because I really should start by asking if you could tell me more about your background. When did you start thinking about equitable development as a praxis? And like what prepared you to really develop a career in equitable development?
I will say I stumbled accidentally into real estate development. I, in truth, knew nothing about it growing up. I don't think I understood what I was seeing when I was seeing the built environment. But I do recall being probably in about middle school or high school. And I grew up in suburban New Jersey, and it's a mix of single family homes and apartment complexes, like garden style apartment complexes. And I remember driving around with my mom and wondering who people who lived in apartment buildings paid their rent to. Yeah, the rent is due the first of the month, but who are we writing these checks to? It's a question I remember to this day because the next question for me was, well, how can I be the person that they're writing the rent checks to? And that was like my simple, like, first inquiry into real estate development. I then went on to kind of crystallize my future career ideas into being an engineer because I had to pick a major. I was good at math and science, engineering. Cool. I did my undergrad at Princeton in engineering, civil engineering. I went on did a master's in structural engineering, started working as a structural engineer, got about 2 years into that job and realized I absolutely hated it. I liked the idea of it, but I knew I really wanted to be more involved in decision making. And it really kind of came to a head when I was sitting at a project table. As a structural engineer, you're the sub hired by the architect who's been hired by the client. And the client's rep was sitting at the table talking about what we were and were not going to do for the project. And it kind of like hit me like a light bulb, like, oh, these are the people who are making decisions about what gets built where, what land is becoming, who gets to use what, how buildings are getting programmed. And yes, I'm here to design a beam in this building, but the decision about what this building is going to be and who gets access to it and who gets to use it is being made on that side of the table by that woman. Ultimately, she's the boss, like she has another boss there too. But that was when I realized, okay, this is absolutely not where I want to be. And I started, poking around in my network to ask about real estate, just reaching out to people, both in undergrad and master's program alumni, who is working in real estate and how can I find out more about what you're doing? And so for me, I think my inquiry into real estate was really around understanding access and decision making. And I landed at the Columbia MS Red program specifically because I had this design background, and the real estate program offered the other half of financial understanding that I did not have in any way, shape, or form. I loved working in the built environment. I loved working in the real estate industry, and I really wanted to understand how to be in a position where I could influence the decisions that were being made about what gets built, where, and for who.
Yeah, that makes sense. Did you immediately, once you graduated from the master's in real estate development program, start teaching as an adjunct, or did you go into a career, work in the field, and then kind of come back?
I went out into the career and then ultimately was invited back to teach equitable development because of my breadth of experiences. So when I left the Columbia MS Red program, I actually moved to Detroit, Michigan and started working for the city of Detroit as a director in the housing and revitalization department, overseeing multifamily development across the city. So essentially anything that had a housing component, whether it was market rate or deeply affordable, crossed my desk. Because of the nature of Detroit, almost everything needed subsidy or a tax abatement or a city council vote or whatever it was. And we on the public side have been invited in with private sector experience to help be able to define real estate strategy. And it gave me a really powerful understanding of what it's like to sit on the public side of the table and make decisions about place on behalf of people, but also understanding the private sector limitations and motivations in who often is executing the development of our built environment, which are private developers. And how do you strike that balance? And so for me, while it wasn't a planned stop on the career path, it's one that really informs the work that I do to this day. I ultimately ended up launching my company after a few years at the city because I knew I wanted to be back on the private side of the table. I wanted to support other developers as a consultant, but I also saw opportunities for me to invest strategically and own real estate in the way that I wanted to in the places that I wanted to. And so, as a result of those experiences during the pandemic, as the MS Red program was growing, I was invited back to teach a course on my experiences. So, I teach a course both on development, real estate development, and then also an elective that you referenced called equitable development, where I really wanted to package all of these kind of unique, but kind of typical for the rest of the United States development challenges that I had grappled with both as a public sector servant, as a private sector developer in places other than New York City. I think New York is a real opportunity, learning opportunity. It's a great laboratory. Columbia has a fantastic MS Red program centered in New York, but the majority of the United States is not our, major cities like the New Yorks, the San Franciscos, the LAs, et cetera. And most people in the United States live in non-urban or semi-urban environments. And sometimes the math doesn't math that easily. And yet development still needs to happen and development is still needed. So what does it look like to strategically develop in an equitable way in places with challenges? What are the tactics, the tools and tactics and strategies that you need to be able to understand to work where the math is a little bit more complicated?
And so what would be the difference between the 2 classes that you teach?
So the first class that I teach is what that I started teaching it has evolved into a core course in the MS Red program, and it is a development fundamentals course. If you see a piece of vacant land, how do you understand the neighborhood? First, we think about the physical site context. We think about the economic context, the neighborhood context. And then how do you define on a market level what is needed? And market could be what's there today, what's coming, what has been there before, what is needed there. How do you define that for a particular site? And then obviously going into the design, we're at GSEP after all. So you go into the design of what can be built here, what does zoning allow? Are there envelopes you can push related to zoning and entitlements to better provide what is needed for this development or to create more value? I always try to give my students the real world experience of being a leader or an orchestrator of a design team, of a development team. So you have your designer, you have your contractor, you're going to have to structure the financing, but then you're also going to have to, if we're talking about housing, fill a property with residents. And so understand that you're designing for the people that you'd like to have or who need to live in your development. And so I really do try to take students from vacant land to what you're projected building. And it's a core piece of the MS Red program. The equitable course is a little different in that it is not exclusive to the MSRED program. It's an interdisciplinary course, so anyone across Columbia can enroll in it. And I've had a wonderful collection of, architects and planners. I've had people from public and international affairs. I've had project managers. I've had undergrads who are interested in tackling development challenges from more of an urban context or a socioeconomic context, not just thinking about real estate and how we pay for this. And so, what I think is really interesting about that is a lot of times those things intersect. We're talking about policy, we're talking about capital, we're talking about people, we're talking about outcomes. And you can't talk about real estate without talking about the users of real estate. And so that's one of the things I like about this course is it allows me to still talk about what I love, which is real estate, but let's really think about what real estate's needed, how does it get financed, and who's using it. And if those things don't line up mathematically, what are the partnerships and collaborations that are necessary to be able to execute?
Right. Definitely something interesting from my perspective about what you do that relates to preservation-based equitable development. But there's also you probably have more planning students than preservation students take your course.
Only had a couple of preservation students. I'm trying to think back over the years. I can think of one to two.
Yeah, it's hard because I think our even though it's, GSAP, what is it? Graduate School of Architecture, Planning, and Preservation, and then also includes real estate development. I think all universities that have these like joint design type of colleges tend to have such really rigid and structured curriculum. And then people have to be very focused and very interested in wanting to pursue understanding development in that way. And I think preservation has historically, as a field, it's been siloed. I mean, preservation as a field has been historically siloed, but like that includes when it comes to planning and architecture. And I think real estate and real estate development is kind of something on the side that most people don't include within that general sphere.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I will say one of the things that I love about the fact that real estate is in the School of Architecture, Planning and Preservation, etc., is that I feel like, and I'm going to make some generalities here, but I think real estate is isolating, even though it is the arc of all of those things that we're talking about. I think it is a fairly exclusionary, as an industry, I find it to be quite exclusionary. And one of the reasons why I was really adamant about selecting GSAP over going for an MBA was the fact that we have a school at Columbia that's focused on the built environment, and you have a discipline within that school that demystifies the capital environment. And like at the end of the day, nothing gets built without money, without capital. And one of the first things I always say to my students in the equitable class is, I'm glad you're here. Even though this is a real estate elective, we are going to talk about real estate, but we're not going to talk about it in an exclusionary way. I want you to bring all of your experiences. I love the fact that it's a multidisciplinary class. I want you to bring all of your experiences. And what I want to do is demystify the capital required for all the things, all the ideas that you have in terms of where someone's going to tell you it can't work, and also show you ways in which it has been done. Because at the end of the day, money is what gets things built or executed or whatever you want to call it. And I think money and capital structuring and finance can be intimidating, if you will. And I'm making generalities again, but a lot of it is addition and subtraction, multiplication and division with some terms that you need to know and understand. And then you then have a PowerPoint to be able to say, yes, I do understand what you're saying. And I've heard that it can be structured in this way. When the answer is, oh, it can't be done because the math doesn't work or the money doesn't work. Yes, maybe, but it has been done. And these are ways that we can do it. Yes, not necessarily easily, but that's the majority of the United States. Development isn't easy, and yet it still gets done.
Mhm. Yeah, everyone I have been talking to who deals with equitable development has a very strong understanding of the financial capacity and what's needed to fully execute these types of projects because development doesn't happen without money. But how do you make it? How do you take something that's inherently an equitable practice and make it into something that is more beneficial for the I would say underrepresented groups or like the community, maybe descendant communities or legacy residents and stuff like that. We don't want to be displacing people. And I think that's where a conversation that I had with Bree Jones of Parity was talking about her work in Baltimore, where it's like trying to do development without displacement, right? Like, I think that's inherently the type of work that you probably try to do as well within your development company. Could you tell me more about what it really means to you to be doing equitable development?
Yeah, there's a couple of points that you're reminding me of. My company, I'm a little weird. I'm a Black American woman with a real estate investment company. That's not typical. And one of the drivers for me in owning my company, being the founder of it, and maintaining ownership of it is that most developers don't look like me. But in a place like Detroit, most of the residents of housing do look like me. And so for me, we throw around the term equitable development. And early on, when I was founding my company, I had this thought that for me, we always talk about equity in the real estate world, we talk about equity as being dollars. But I actually think for me, equity is about representation as well, because there are so many decisions that I make, set aside Black and real estate, and just as a woman, I do housing. A lot of my tenants are women. I'm a mother. A lot of my tenants are parents of children. And so even the decisions that I make about how I design a floor plan or how practical a kitchen counter tile choice is for cooking or something like that comes from a place of experience. And I can't tell you the number of conversations I've had with other developers, mostly men, mostly not men of color, where the real estate is an asset that lives in Excel. And it's not a real the visualization of it as a real home for people is not how they think about what they're developing on a daily basis. And so I think that representation is really important to delivering what people need and doing it in a technical way that truly delivers what people need. The second thing that I think you mentioned development without displacement. And so that is a core ethos of Kipling's work. So, for example, one of our projects, we purchased a multifamily building that was originally affordable in a really high growth neighborhood where there's a lot of investment happening, a lot of new construction happening, rents are rising. And this property was in danger of being emptied out and sold as a market rate project for redevelopment because the demand was there, the rents are there. And so for us, we were very tactical about putting the property under contract, identifying both private and public capital that was focused on preservation of affordable housing. And we were able to commit to long term affordability with additional subsidy that allowed us to recapitalize the project, so reinvest in the project and improve quality of life for existing residents that were in that property and commit to long term rental growth cap. So that property, even though the neighborhood is experiencing a lot of upward rent pressure, this property will be deed restricted for the next 30 years. And so even if it's affordable today, it'll be affordable in 5 years, it'll be affordable in 10 years. And it's pegged to what affordability looks like at whatever point we're looking at with the market over the next 10, 15 to 30 years. And so those are the types of projects that we try to do on repeat where we see vulnerabilities that we can protect against with the right partnerships. And so for us, a big piece of our work is public private partnerships, collaboration with community. And it's part of what my curriculum is based on with the equitable class. Projects like that do happen. They don't necessarily get highlighted as real estate development projects, but they are real estate development projects. And there are developers like myself that are doing work like that. I think the last piece that I always find really interesting in terms of, when we get to that point of the syllabus or the curriculum for my equitable development class is the conversation around gentrification and displacement. I mean, you can't not acknowledge it because investment breeds attention, which breeds people wanting to be there, which makes people who are there vulnerable, oftentimes renters, seniors, et cetera, right? And so everyone does want to live somewhere that's desirable, that's safe, that's protected, that's beautiful, and that receives investment. I don't think the answer ever is do nothing so that people stay exactly in the condition that they're in. I don't think that's the right answer. And so, really taking the time to understand the nuances of what community is in a place that's about to receive investment and are there ways that you can protect against displacement, I think is a really important role of the public sector. And the public sector has to have relationships with the private sector who have an aligned mission in seeing those outcomes happen.
What you've said makes me think about the community aspect. Like, what I would love to understand is how you've tackled the community engagement process or how you have adapted it to make it work for the needs of the whole and the people that are there, right? Because I think at the end of the day, you're not doing community engagement to check a box.
Yeah, I can definitely talk about community engagement from the private side, but definitely grew my understanding of what good engagement looks like on the public side of the table. At the time when I joined the City of Detroit's Housing and Revitalization Department, we were at a point where the City of Detroit owned, I want to say 50 to 60% of the land area in Detroit, had fallen onto the city, into city ownership through tax foreclosure or other reasons, which is a really unhealthy and unstable economic environment for a city to live in. So that means that the maintenance and ownership and you're not receiving tax revenue and you're responsible for maintaining it, so you just quickly fall upside down. And so for us, we were tasked early on with coordinating with the planning department on thinking about opportunities for redevelopment, coordinating with planning efforts that involve thinking about commercial corridors and their residential backbones. So looking at communities, a set of communities that were anchored by particular commercial corridors and thinking about how do we coordinate investment, knowing that we have control of public assets, we have public resources that can be invested in, we probably have private sector partners that we think can deliver the type of work that we want delivered. How can we best support and orchestrate that? without spreading the investment peanut butter, quote unquote, too thin around the city, but think about how we can tactically invest in certain areas. And that requires a lot of engagement. I think, especially when you're coming into a city or coming into a community post a bankruptcy, which is pretty unusual for a major city in the United States, that where promises have been made in the past that have not been kept. And the city of Detroit is majority Black, 85% Black, and most of the development community in Detroit is not that. There's a lot of distrust. And so engagement was a fundamental piece. Before you even talk about investment, developing a relationship with community again was really the first step. And so it looks different. I think it's so, I caution my class, my equitable class, that we throw around the word community. There's generalities associated with that word, but that community can look very different for very different projects. It can be people who already live here. It can be people who are coming there. It can be business owners. It can be children. If we're talking about investment in a park or a school, it is the adults, yes, but it can be children. It can be future generation. And so I think being really thoughtful about defining community is step number one and incredibly important. What engagement looks like for different pieces of that community is very different. One really important example is, I'll go back to being a parent again. If you put in a community engagement meeting at 5 p.m. on a Wednesday, I cannot come. I've got kid pickup. I've got to go home, get them dinner. There's no way they're going to want to sit there while I try to listen to or engage with my community about something that I may be incredibly passionate about. I may not even be off of work yet. And so the idea that you planned a community meeting and I didn't show up, and trivializing the fact that I didn't show up into it looking like I'm not interested in being engaged is unfair to community. And so I think if you understand community and you have a relationship, but then you understand how to actually meet them where they need you to meet them. So that's like lesson number two, is all community engagement is not equal. And then I think the last piece is being upfront and managing expectations of outcomes. Everything is not a yes, and everyone is not going to walk away happy. And that's okay, because it's unrealistic to set the expectation that everyone's going to get what they want. So those are probably my three easy lessons from community engagement that I've gained over the years working on both the public and the private side.
Yeah, definitely. I really want to ask about how storytelling has been able to play into the community development. But before I do, I think it might be important if I ask if you could like paint a picture of what the built environment looks like in Detroit today. And you could kind of also speak to like what it looked like when you were first starting in the public sector.
It's interesting to me to reflect on how much Detroit has evolved in the 10 years that I've been working in it, because I think I lose sight of progress because I still see what needs to be done. So I like answering questions like this because it makes me reflect on change that has happened and also reflect on my opinion of that change. When I first pulled into Detroit, I think it was summer 2014, and it was probably middle of the week, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, middle of a work day, and all the traffic lights were blinking in downtown, which is a very eerie experience coming from the East Coast. And I mean, Detroit's a major American city, right? We're not talking about like a rural one light town. It's a major American city, and all the traffic lights are blinking in the middle of a work week. Like, one of the big markers that anyone can Google and see now is the Michigan train station. It was like the icon of Detroit ruin porn for many years, and was still looked exactly like the picture of no windows. Like, picture Central Station with a beautiful tower on top of it, no windows, and the sunlight pouring through it. So it's this beautiful, like, apocalyptic kind of image. But that was what it really looked like. And then last June, June 24th, 2024, they had this grand opening ceremony with performers who were from Detroit, and just an amazing celebration of a building being reopened as Ford's headquarters. And that's a 10-year span. And there's still vacant houses and vacant lots that need to be mowed and maintained, and the city still owns too much land, and there's still vacant, beautiful, ornate, vacant school buildings, and there's not enough population. But then you have the other side of downtown now, is that all four major sports teams, NFL, NBA, MLB, and NHL, are all in downtown Detroit with 3 stadiums. And you've got the tallest tower of Michigan being built there, and a lot of the buildings that were vacant before are no longer vacant and they're redeveloped. Now, the flip side of that is you had a lot of billionaires invest in downtown Detroit. So I'm you get both and, right? And so I think there's been a lot of progress. We've got 140 square miles of neighborhoods that need investment too, but you need I think you need a strong urban core, and someone had to invest when in what was needed to be invested in. I think idealistically it probably could have looked something like something different, but then you have tax base, you have revenue, you have interest. And so it's really hard to say I'm not proud of Detroit for the evolution that it's going through, but I think it's really important that the people participating in that evolution have a range of perspectives so that the outcome is balanced.
Mhm. So the urban core sports arena area, when was that, like, built up? Was that, 1990s, 2000s?
The most recent stadium was finished. It was the Little Caesars Arena, is where the Detroit Pistons and now the Detroit Red Wings play. Is Was built in 2017, and then Ford Field and the Comerica Park were there first. The Joe Louis Arena had been on the riverfront. That's been torn down and is now, I want to say, mixed use hotel and apartment getting built there. So right on the waterfront, or right on the waterfront of Detroit. And so there's been some shifts, but then you have the teams coming in from where they, even though they were Detroit teams, they were 45 minutes out in the suburb, now coming into downtown. And so you do have this legacy and this memory and this history associated with entertainment that at least now is actually in the city of Detroit versus claiming to be Detroit and actually is elsewhere in Michigan. So that's a change. It's unique. There Most cities don't have that, to have athletic teams based in their actual city limits, and claim the city's name. And so I think that's a win in some ways. But people still ask the question of, well, if everything's happening in downtown, what's happening in my neighborhood? And that's not everyone's question, but there are still questions about what happens in neighborhoods when things don't pencil or the math doesn't necessarily make sense.
Yeah, because well, as an outsider and, like, granted, I was living in Cincinnati and had gone to Detroit a few times, and I remember just going to visit and seeing because it was like the traditional I mean, I don't know, what was this, like, maybe 8 or so years ago? Like, I remember seeing the vacant lots, I remember seeing decrepit homes, I remember seeing just driving through, I feel like reminiscent of what you were saying about the blinking lights, that you've got these very wide streets and then you have a place where there are neighborhoods that have had a lot of homes and then they've either fallen into disrepair and probably to the point where or at least the city could have potentially thought, these homes are not repairable. So then from that, I remember there being a lot, especially in the news as well, of fires being started and arson happening throughout Detroit, right? The homes would burn down, so then they would be bulldozed and then there'd be vacant lots. So lots of vacancy, lots of really like open like places that used to probably be way more concentrated and then the built residential landscape has disappeared and with that there's been a lot of digression in terms of the commercial corridors. So that's the Detroit that I'm familiar with. I think that would be the Detroit that most people have heard about as well. But that, like I mentioned, was like 8 or so years ago. What are some of the neighborhoods look like today and have they recovered from that?
Recovered is a interesting word, right?
Yeah. I'm, like, laughing because 'cause I'm like, "That's not really the right word," but, like,
No,
right?
I think recovered is a really hard word to use because, yeah, I think there's some individuals that have regained their footing. What you're describing is exactly right about Detroit. And I think there are a couple of moments in history where that loss of density, that loss of concentration, that loss of strength of urban fabric has happened. I think there's the urban renewal moments where Detroit was raised by highway for highway plans, and we lost a lot of our historically Black neighborhoods. And then there were the building of stadiums, which are other, large scale capital projects in probably the 90s that I wish I could like peg the date, but I imagine it's in the 90s where you again are erasing neighborhoods. And then you have this economic fallout with the loss of jobs that were the reason why people moved to Detroit in the first place. That $5 a day, like American dream legacy of Detroit of working for the car companies that then imploded and economically devastated families, which then led to them leaving. And so the house is there, but the family is gone. So you lose population density instead of physical density. And then to your point, when that deteriorates, you bulldoze it, and now you've lost physical density too. So there's been repeat moments throughout history where Detroit has lost its density and its urban fabric. And so more often than not, that urban condition still exists in Detroit. I could not honestly sit here and say otherwise. There's 140 square miles. And so I think there are some examples of neighborhoods that have retained their density, have retained their homes, where population kind of huddled down and kept it going, mowed the lots themselves, repaired homes themselves, bought, repaired, sold homes to bring back neighborhood neighbors and retain neighborhood density. A lot of the historic neighborhoods have been well preserved and are, well stewarded by people who've lived in Detroit their whole lives. But you have to have disposable income to do that. And so just like there are neighborhoods where it did work and you could afford to protect your neighborhood, if you will, just as many neighborhoods were lost or did not get that same treatment or investment because you simply didn't have the resources or the people who, yes, they may have wanted to, but were not able to. And so, yeah, it's both and. I think there's some people that have certainly regained their footing and property values have increased. They've regained the value in their homes that they lost, over the last 20 years, or, call it the 1990s and early 2000s, or whichever economic cycle we're going to talk about, right? But then there are others where it doesn't make sense to even rehab the house because the cost to build is more than the actual value, appraised value. And then you can't get a mortgage because the house is already upside down. And yet people still want to live there because that's home to them. And so, like, mathematically or economically, it doesn't make sense. And so funds aren't flowing there. So Detroit is really a story of both and. Unfortunately, I am excited by the fact that a lot of the public sector people they're focused on housing are focused on it from a policy mindset, understanding that it's not just an economic question, it's a need question. And so how can we solve on behalf of the people that are looking to us for support? With me being on the private side now, with my company being on the private side and it is a for-profit business, it does limit the things that we can invest in and or purchase because we have lenders and investors that we're responsible for. Yes, mission oriented, but it's not a foundation in that sense. I love the balance that I get with my consulting work though, because I can take on jobs that are thinking about policy. I can sit there and strategically think through something with a public housing authority or a public sector or a nonprofit that is focused on this work and does have resources that are committed to them for them to think about how do we support seniors aging in place in their homes where they have lived for 60 years and still want to continue to live there. And yet it's not in the investment path, the path of investment. Like, what does that look like? Those types of questions are still important to me, and why I love being able to bridge both the academic world with the consulting world and the for-profit world as a company, because I get to talk about the things that I'm passionate about and support people in achieving the goals that I know need to happen, while also continuing to invest in places, like I mentioned before, where it does make sense to invest in a way that both does well and does good.
Yeah, I think for me, storytelling comes into play because sometimes, well, in terms of preservation, you can't preserve something that's not capable of being preserved. Like if the built landscape doesn't exist anymore, you have to build new. Like I mean, it's in Cincinnati. I think it's more of a case of like a building could be preserved, like an old African American school could be preserved to be transformed into affordable housing, but oftentimes developers and maybe even city officials might not think that that particular place being rehabbed would produce enough housing. So then they're like, well, we'll tear it down and then just build something bigger. I'm wondering what the case is in Detroit in terms of preservation. Like, how does that come into play into either the work that you engage with or just in general? Does preservation have a place in Detroit? And I'm very specifically talking about when it comes to lower income, underserved populations, right? Mostly, I'm thinking about places that people in the communities find significant, and how have they maybe not been able to keep some of these either homes or institutions or neighborhoods kind of reminding them of their past.
Think the question about, okay, storytelling and preservation is an interesting one because you have a city like Detroit that's rich with history. There's a lot of physical assets and memories of physical assets present there. And you're right when you're talking when the economic challenge of, it's almost one layer deeper. It's almost, yeah, we could tear it down because it's more cost effective to build something denser and new construction. It's more efficient, I guess, if you will. But there's almost another layer of some of the volume of physical assets in Detroit is such that it almost is debilitating to even tear them down because there isn't an economic environment to build them back. So then you have what I found a lot of times is there's these assets that have deep memory attached to them and are important to preserve from a construction perspective. One example is Detroit's school building portfolio. Absolutely impressive. Built for a population of almost 2 million. And today the population is 6 to 700,000. And so you have a lot of infrastructure, and I'm going to consider schools as infrastructure meant for a population. At what point, though, do you need all of these assets? And in the meantime, you have to mothball them, preserve them, reuse them, redevelop them, whatever the outcome is that's going to be of them, or maybe demolish because they haven't been maintained in a way, for lack of resources, in a way that there will be something to salvage in a way that makes any sense at the point where it even makes sense to redevelop. And it's costly to demolish them, it's costly to preserve them, and you don't have the population that needs them either.
Right, I mean, like, they can't go back to being a school because that's not necessary.
Yeah.
So then what do you do with them, right?
What do you do with them is the question. And so I've seen some of them get redeveloped into housing, affordable housing for sure. I've seen them developed into market rate housing. I've seen others try to develop them into, they've been reused as schools, maybe not elementary, middle, or high school, but maybe a college comes in and expands there, or a specific type of technical school might come in. I'm trying to think what else I've seen. Event spaces have been really interesting because you get people who are like, I want to turn this into a wedding venue. And, you definitely get attract that type of interest in this beautiful architecture, right? That's quite unique within an urban environment. I think from a company perspective, I would love to redevelop all of these schools. Like that would be the biggest passion project that we could pursue. And from an underwriting perspective or a financing perspective, the cost to redevelop doesn't make sense for us today, but it's something I keep my eye on all the time because it's a project that I would like to do. I think what's really cool about the school infrastructure is they're always located within neighborhoods. They were essential infrastructure for neighborhoods. And so what does it look like to add density back to neighborhoods in school buildings that are, often on multi acres within a neighborhood, and like put back the hole what's sitting in the middle of the neighborhood is like this big major point of vacancy. um, that would be a desired project for Kipling to pursue or consult on. Honestly, that would be fulfilling in its own way.
Yeah, I totally feel you. I think there's a lot because these are not one-room schools. These are ginormous, maybe Jacobsonian style, collegiate Gothic, 1930s-esque schools. I think for Detroit, there's definitely more vacancy than in Cincinnati. Some of the schools in Cincinnati have been there's like one like church that had owned a school and then they like utilized and like rented out a lot of these old classrooms, and it was really cool. Like I went over there early on when I was doing just like some black sites preservation work with a local nonprofit before I started my nonprofit. Actually, it might have been around the same time. I started my nonprofit Urbanist Media because I felt that the conversations and the actual preservation work that it needs to be done in communities of color wasn't being achieved through true community or neighborhood conversations. And that's really where storytelling comes into play for me. So I guess kind of going back to where I prefaced storytelling, for what I do, it's about how storytelling can lead to better conversations with the residents, local residents, and how it can also help inform the larger public. Specifically, I really do like to focus neighborhood by neighborhood, but city-wise too. So, like the first season of the Urban Roots podcast is narrative, and it was all about African American history in Cincinnati, but very specific to at least just three neighborhoods. I didn't live in those neighborhoods, but I would identify, find, or try to work with the community voices, essentially long-term residents who've lived in these places who can speak to what changes looked like over time. And that's a method that I really want to take into a lot of other cities. So, like Detroit being one of them, right? I think that it sounds like it would be really useful to be able to dive into these historical perspectives in a way that where you're talking about the history, but then you get to connect it to the present day. And so all of these episodes that I've developed and all the ones that I continue to do that are narrative based, I really try to speak to the past and the present and the future, right? Because we don't know, like there just aren't a lot of resources available for people in neighborhoods to do this work themselves. And I guess I'm thinking about, even community development work can be maybe better improved. I've already been developing it. After the interviews, after the season comes out, I like to continue working with the communities that I've been engaging with, and I'll do like listen and learns in the neighborhoods. And so I'll bring in clips from the podcast episode, and I've done it where I've brought also on the people who were long-term residents that I spoke with. And so it'd be like a panel discussion, but then I play the clips and it has become a community conversation with the other people who are in the room who are not on the panel. And I think part of it is folks realize, oh wow, somebody is actually sharing the story that we've experienced, and we can talk about it now. But also storytelling helps us remember that there are historical like trends, and particularly like when it comes to inequity, there are things that need to be redressed, and the question is like, how do we do that? Those are the types of questions that I'm also trying to take into my PhD work at Columbia, to really understand how this can be done on a holistic level, because I started the nonprofit before and the podcast before I started my PhD program. I was kind of able to see what works, to try a couple things out. And what I've learned is that it really benefits the people who live there, and I just can't get the other folks on board. Yeah. Yeah, I agree. I think and the way that I do it is really I will go into the communities and record oral histories, right? And then that's something that you can give back to people, and then taking those oral histories and then helping form that linear, maybe more chronological story so that broader audiences can actually understand how these transformations have impacted the people, because that's really what it comes down to. And that's a form of preservation, right? That's what I see as a form of preservation. Yeah. Yeah. So before I end here, I would love to just make sure that, is there anything else that you wanted to speak to about either equitable development or your work in any of the capacities that you do? Did we miss anything? Oh, that's fair. I think that in some ways it's hard for people, like, kind of even like you mentioned with when you're doing community engagement and you have to like work within what people can do and their capacity and their time, but like there seems to be this level of disconnect between the public and policy. So maybe there like could be ways to help make it easier for people to understand that policy. Maybe it's the storytelling, maybe it when engagement happens, there's a level of education that comes with it from the maybe the part of the city or whatever, because especially, right, you're talking about local policy. So, like, what things change all the time in terms of policy. I think that becomes another thing that's hard to keep up with. So, I guess my, like, last question then would be, how, as just a resident, do you think that we could try to understand that more? Like, where do we go to learn more about that? I mean, we can Google things that we hear, but things that we don't hear, how do we know what's happening? Yeah, fair. Oh, thank you. I think that was a great way to end off kind of the conversation is like we will continue to try to do our parts in helping people understand these various areas and levels of development and equity. So thank you so much for your time, Cecily. This was super great. Thank you for listening to this Urban Roots episode, and huge thanks to Cecily King, founder of Kipling Development and associate professor of professional practice with Columbia GSAP's Real Estate Development Program. And thanks to our episode sponsor, Layla Youssef, a licensed real estate buyers and sellers agent with Compass who works in Manhattan, Philadelphia, and Bucks County, PA. If you're interested in working with Layla, you can email her at layla.yusuf@compass.com. That's LEILA.YUSUF@compass, COMPASS.com. Your host is me, Deaqua Hussein Watzel, and this episode was edited by myself and Skylar Ficklin, mixing by Skylar Ficklin. And if you don't already, and you don't know, you can follow us on Instagram and Facebook at Urban Roots Culture, or subscribe to our YouTube page at Urban Roots Podcast. If you really like what we do, please take a moment to rate us or leave a review on Apple Podcast. It actually really helps give us a boost in the podcast world. Urban Roots is part of the nonprofit Urbanist Media, and for this Giving Tuesday, we've launched our Kinfolk Give Back initiative, a place where you can show up for your community like you show up for family. Every single gift, big or small, helps us preserve the cultural heritage of underrepresented neighborhoods, places, and spaces. From oral histories with elders to cultural memory preservation work, our nonprofit seeks to amplify Black and Brown lives across the diaspora. We very much rely on your support, so please check out the show notes to learn how to be a part of our Kinfolk Give Back program today. Or you can be a sustained giver. If you're a fan of Patreon, you can become a monthly subscriber for as little as $1 and get early access to new Urbanist Media content. Okay, I think that wraps it up. Thank you so much for listening to Urban Roots, the podcast that preserves place through story.